Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Velodyne Lidar Live, where we bring you real-time conversations with experts from all areas of the mobility industry. I'm Pamela Gauchi, your host for this episode, and joining me is my co-host, Mary, who's running slides in the background. Today's episode features a fantastic group of panelists and a discussion that revolves around LiDAR-enabled safety solutions and protecting vulnerable road users. This panel will be moderated by Mircea Gradu, Velodyne's very own Senior Vice President of Automotive Programs. A little bit about Mircea. Before joining Velodyne, he began his career at Daimler-Benz AG in Stuttgart and also led engineering and quality at Hyundai Motor America. Mircea was also corporate officer in charge of transmission, powertrain, and driveline at Fiat Chrysler and an automotive executive at the Timken Company. He's been awarded 56 patents on mechatronic automotive systems, has published more than 40 technical papers, and is a board member and the 2018 president of SAE International. Mircea was also named one of the 50 most influential automotive executives by Motor Trend and received the SAE Ed Cole Award for Innovation. He holds a master's degree in mechanical engineering from the Polytechnic Institute of Bucharest and a doctorate in mechanical engineering from the University of Stuttgart. Now, we have a lot of ground to cover and just about 45 minutes to cover it. So I'm going to go ahead and pass things over to Mircea. But first, I do want to encourage our viewers to use that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask questions anytime during the episode. And as always, this episode is being recorded and will be available to view on Velodyne Lidar's YouTube channel. So now I'd like to welcome Mircea Gradu, Senior Vice President of Automotive Programs at Velodyne. Welcome, Mircea.
Thank you, Pam, and thank you, Mary, for supporting us. Also, welcome to our great audience. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you're located. I would like to start by extending a very warm welcome and thank you to our distinguished set of panelists. I think we have 3 individuals that are outstanding in their accomplishments, very relevant to the topic that we are addressing today. Not only on the individual level, but also their organizations are extremely active in this area, and I think we'll have a lot of good information to share. So I'll start with Ms. Mandy Bishop, who's the Deputy Director of Public Service assigned as the Smart Columbus Program Manager. Mandy joined the City of Columbus in July 2017, and she uses her 22 years of experience with an emphasis on complex project management to lead the delivery of the US DOT, Balkan and American Climate Change Challenge grant-funded programs. Mandy also oversees finance, human resources, and Vision Zero for the department. Prior to joining Columbus, Mandy was a senior project manager with the JPT Group managing public improvements for the City of Dublin. She served as the staff lead for the governor's 21st Century Priorities Task Force, and later as Deputy Director of Planning for ODOT. Mandy works every day to serve people to her work and leave the world a little better than when she arrived. The second panelist is Ms. Jane Terry, who's the Vice President of Government Affairs at the National Safety Council. She has very strong background and is very experienced with policy and legislation. She has more than 20 years of experience working with local, state, and federal government officials on transportation, telecommunications, workplace safety, community development, and healthcare initiatives. At NSC, she leads outreach to policymakers at all levels of government to eliminate preventable deaths. Her efforts provided the foundation for the Road to Zero Coalition and led to more effective partnership and implementation of new laws and much more. She's a regularly requested speaker on NSC initiatives such as the Road to Zero, the opioid epidemic, and the workplace safety. And the third panelist, Mr. Kim W.G., he's the Director of Safety and Mobility for the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, AASHTO, a nonprofit, nonpartisan association which advocates transportation-related policies and provides technical services to support states in their provision for the efficient and safe movement of people and goods. In this role, Mr. G leads AASHTO staff in the transportation safety, system operations, and mobility functions of AASHTO, as well as the cross-cutting areas of knowledge management and international exchange and collaboration. He oversees and coordinates support to AASHTO leadership and the state DOTS, Department of Transportation, on safety initiatives with an emerging transportation technology and mobility concepts such as cooperative automated transportation, which includes connected vehicles and automated vehicles, unmanned aerial systems, and mobility as a service. So with that, given the relatively short time that we have, we'll dive directly into our webinar topics. And starting with the first topic, the technology driving major improvements to general traffic safety. I think first, actually, to give you an overview on all topics. So that's certainly the first and kind of common denominator between all the organizations that we invited to participate. Second topic is related to the potential of autonomous vehicles and ADAS technologies to prevent deaths and injuries for VRUs, the VRUs being vulnerable road users like cyclists, motorcyclists, and pedestrians. Third topic, which will be also extremely interesting, is the smart city initiatives. And we have the pleasure to host Mandy, who's the Smart Columbus program manager. And we'll talk about the advanced and safety-oriented LiDAR-centric solutions, but also any other safety-enhancing initiative within the program. And lastly, we were planning to present you some of the results that we acquired in testing and validating some of the Velodyne technology developments, especially with respect to ADAS solutions that are expanding the operational design domain, covering also low light conditions, which are extremely critical for vehicle operation. So with that overview, again, we'll dive into the first topic. And as I mentioned, there is a common denominator between the personal interests, individual interests of our panelists, as well as the focus of their organizations, and that is the road to zero. For the audience that is not familiar with the term, it's actually a great initiative involving multiple industries, involving multiple participants. And the task at hand and the objective is actually to reduce deaths to zero by 2050. So I will start with Jane, because NSC is actually one of the leading organizations that certainly foster this concept. And Jane, perhaps you can give us your view on the initiative and also some of the highlights.
Thank you for the question, and also just thank you for inviting me and the National Safety Council to be here today for this discussion. I always love talking about ways to save lives on the roadway. So the Road to Zero was started in 2016 through a partnership between the National Safety Council and the U.S. Department of Transportation. And we got together other key leaders in this space. One of those, of course, being my co-panelist, King G from AASHTO, and several others to really be leaders on this group to bring together all the various stakeholders in this space and things you may not think about, even from the emergency response for crashes and the important role that they play to ensuring that people are able to survive crashes when they do happen. Coming out of the work of the Road to Zero Coalition, which you can still join today. It's free to join. We've got over 1,700 members. In 2018, we issued a report with 3 main goals in that we said would help us reach zero. And that's double down on what we know works using those data-driven approaches, advanced technology, which of course is the focus of what we're talking about here today, and then also prioritize safety and thinking about that safe systems approach. And these are things we're still working towards today that we really think can help move the needle and reduce fatalities.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your comments. I would like to give Mandy the chance to also comment, given that Smart Columbus is certainly very much aligned with the Road to Zero initiative.
Yeah, Smart Columbus is very much aligned with the initiative. I also want to share that I oversee our Vision Zero initiative, which is our local effort to reduce serious injury and fatal crashes. When we undertook the Smart Columbus program, we really focused on the technology side of helping people either access transportation and mobility or do it more safely. And so we had an autonomous vehicle component as well as a connected vehicle component. And what I really love about the connected vehicle environment, it's the first time that the OEMs, the original equipment manufacturers, the car manufacturers, and our infrastructure people are really talking. And we're literally, talking through signals in our roadway. And it's something I think has been a disconnect in the industry for a long time, but it's the first time as a civil engineer, I'm actually talking to Honda or Nissan and those different type of companies. From a Vision Zero perspective, we're really focused on safe system. And we're focused, we learned that 60% of our serious injury and fatal crashes occur on 10% of our network. And we know that if we reduce speed and if we separate our vulnerable road users, that we can and accommodate them better, we can really make great strides on that road to zero.
Thank you, Mandy. And King, what's the AASHTO vision on this?
Thank you. A few years before the Road to Zero Coalition was formed, we had watched the fatality rates basically plateau. We had settled around 1.1 fatalities per 100 million vehicle miles of travel. And we just recognized we needed to do something different if we're going to really get to zero. And so 8 associations that represent the law enforcement side, the infrastructure side, the engineering, the emergency medical services, and education got together and said, we need to get our minds together in a multidisciplinary approach. And that's what resulted in a Towards Zero Deaths national strategy. And so there are 6 areas of emphasis: safer drivers and passengers, safer vulnerable users, safer vehicles, safer infrastructure, enhanced enhanced emergency medical services, and improved safety management. And so when the Road to Zero Coalition was birthed, a key element of doubling down on what works are the strategies and the countermeasures that are included in the Towards Zero Deaths national strategy. And so we are a strong partner because we believe it really takes all sectors in a multidisciplinary fashion that is represented by the Road to Zero Coalition.
Thank you, Ken. So a very interesting report was written by the RAND Corporation, and that captures the majority of the important aspects of the what the coalition focuses on. And I'd like to circle back to Jane as again one of the initiating organizations of the Road to Zero initiative. And there are these 3 very common sense, very practical items that have been listed as being, the way things will get accomplished by 2050. And one of them certainly is double down on what works to proven and evidence-based technologies. Second being advanced life-saving technology in vehicles and infrastructure. And then third one, prioritize safety by adopting a safe systems approach and creating a positive safety culture. So any comments on these 3 bullet points and anything that can provide the audience with more color around those?
Yeah, these are really where we've been focusing the attention of the coalition and certainly the outreach to, say, policymakers around these 3 areas, because they can't work independent of each other. They really are dependent on each one of them working together to help us to reach zero fatalities. And so some of the things we know, like high visibility enforcement to deal with impaired driving, that's a double down on what works. We know that that can change behavior of people behind the wheel. How do we incorporate that with thinking about then what's next in technology? And is there technology out there, we know there is, that would even prevent a vehicle from starting if somebody's impaired behind the wheel? And then also just thinking about how do we use, really prioritize safety in all that we do so that people hopefully are not at a point where they're able to make that decision of having too much to drink, say, for example, and then getting behind the wheel. And that's really about prioritizing safety. And so how do we think of these things all together, working just hand in hand with each other when we're making decisions about infrastructure, about roadway design, about city design? I'm sure Mandy can speak to that very well. And so many other aspects that go into this, not just thinking about roads and sidewalks.
Yeah, that's a very important aspect that also Mandy emphasized. This kind of work together between infrastructure, vehicles, and certainly, yeah, this very, as I said, common sense, practical approach creates the opportunity for that. On that note, I know, King, the AASHTO initiatives are listing specifically the items under vehicle and under smart infrastructure. And perhaps you can expand a little bit more on those items.
Sure, and I listed the 6 emphasis areas, and in a sense, those came about before automated vehicles and connected vehicles became much more real. They're not here yet, but it's much more real today than it was back in the early 2010s. And so to Jane's point that we can't move independently, for 100 years now in this country and the world, we've had car makers making cars. We've had infrastructure owners designing and building roads. And then we relied on the driver to make it all work. And so with technology, there's an opportunity to really integrate all 3, especially with AI potentially replacing some of the human driver responsibilities. And so I think that this is something we need to move together. And I think a big light bulb moment on Road to Zero was when we realized technology can really make a big difference. It's been reported by NHTSA that 94% of all crashes is due to some kind of human action, whether it's intentional or unintentional. And to bridge that, there's a huge opportunity for technology to make a big dent in those 94% situations. Because at the end of the day, it is about situational awareness that technology can provide to avoid crashes, and then to also enhance the behavior, the response when something does happen.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple of interesting aspects also in the brief correspondence that we had prior to the webinar. And a couple of things that attracted my attention were the use of vehicle data for specifically related to hard braking, hard cornering, and then the use of infrastructure to improve the ADAS and AD performance. So both this were under the safer infrastructure, and perhaps either you or Mandy or both can comment on this specific aspects, perhaps starting with you, King.
Yeah.
Again,
thank you. I think a big part of the reality that we face today is the infrastructure is out there. It took us decades to put the infrastructure out there, and there are elements that are not as conducive to safety as others. And I think what Mandy is doing in Smart Columbus is attacking some of that with technology, because it takes decades to flip the infrastructure, even as it takes 30 years to flip the car fleet in this country. And so technology is going to help us bridge some of those areas that will help us to get to safer roads.
Yeah, I definitely agree with King on that. On our high injury network, it's a lot of 5-lane, 6-lane corridors where we're seeing, higher speeds. They're 50 miles an hour. When we installed our connected vehicle environment, we started to understand how the alerts and where the alerts were happening for, say, red light running or intersection movement assist or intersection collision warnings, and really garnering more understanding of where there's a lot and there's higher risk behavior. And I think connected vehicle technology, it has to come quickly. It has to get out there. I think I saw a statistic on USDOT's website where it said 85% of crashes could be eliminated with connected vehicle technology implemented at scale. So we're only scratching the surface with, say, a 26-mile corridor of connected vehicle and some large amount of uncertainty around cellular CV2X as opposed to DSRC, which is what we currently have installed. And we're bridging that gap with some technology, but we also need some certainty at the federal level and some deployment demonstrations. I am happy to see there's some funds available to correct or reinstall CV2X technology into our DSRC systems in that infrastructure bill. But overall, I do want to reinforce that we have to design our infrastructure to be more forgiving, and that includes technology as part of the practice.
You brought up a very interesting aspect, and I just wanted to confirm that the approach is materializing now. This idea of actually identifying the high-risk areas, is that including like intersections that are prone to accidents for some reason, and then prioritizing them higher in terms of instrumenting them and so on in Columbus?
So it's both. We learn a lot from our crash data, which is, retrospective. What we're really trying to focus on, and we've explored various technology platforms. We're looking at where the high risk behavior is happening that may start to have safety issues as traffic volumes increase and be in the proactive position. And that's where technologies like Velodyne Lidar and other platforms that we see can be assistive in that manner. So it's both proactive and reactive.
And I would just add,
sure. Jane,
real quick. That's great that Columbus is doing that. And we really encourage more localities to look at these high crash corridors and also to try to be proactive. What are those leading indicators of dangerous behavior that could lead to a crash? And what we're seeing when communities do that is that it's a fairly concentrated number of lane miles where these events are happening. And so what it does is it allows these communities to really go in and target what they know are the most dangerous areas through those data-driven approaches and use innovative ways to deal with it, like technology, thinking about redesign of roadways and things like that too. And King, I apologize there.
No, that's good to have multiple takers on the question, so please. Go ahead.
So when we think about artificial intelligence, we typically think of it in the vehicle. But in the system management area, as Mandy was pointing to, if we can take the data and do some analysis with artificial intelligence, we can actually predict. And even if we can't predict, we can figure out what some systemic solutions might be. A parallel is when you think about highways and the median strip, the crossover crashes was a big problem. And systemically, instead of treating them hotspot by hotspot, many of the states, if not all of them, have gone through installing cable median guardrail. Just because the cost is relatively low, but the prevention of a crossover crash and those head-on crashes are very devastating. So with artificial intelligence, we can actually look ahead and see what we can do as a preventive measure.
Very good. So interestingly, as we progress from the 37,000 deaths annually to the target, which is 0 by 2050, there are a lot of items listed as being important in this journey. And I think one that is very relevant to the topic of the webinar is the adoption of the technology performance standards. And you brought up a great point, King, not only the adoption, but the implementation, because certainly you can be aware of standards, you can create standards, but implementing them and actually enforcing them is another very important aspect. So perhaps you can comment a little bit on the standards, and then also I will let Jane and Mandy comment also on the legislation supporting them and how the main drivers of the legislation are moving toward, again, making them happen, because again, a paper standard is worthless. And that was your great point, Tim. So go ahead.
I think we are moving ahead on technical standards. The SAE International is doing a lot of good work in that area. I think the implementation is where it comes to a soft spot, where unless the U.S. Department of Transportation through NHTSA mandates certain of these performance standards, the automakers are going to go about it their own way, which is not bad, but we need some standardization so that it's even across the board. I think the reality is that we don't really have the data for performance standards yet. I know that for ADAS, NHTSA has a third-party effort called PARTS that benchmarks the performance of ADAS systems. And from that, eventually we'll get to some performance standards that will be agreed upon by industry as well as the safety advocates.
Jane, any additional comments, or Mandy?
Yeah, we certainly need the performance standards out there so that any of us going in, say, to buy a new vehicle, we know if we're going to have AEB, we know it's going to perform the same whether we're buying a Toyota, a Mazda, a Ford, or whatever the type of vehicle. And we need that certainty. We call it one level of safety for all people who are out there operating in the system. And so we've certainly been very supportive of NHTSA doing the work to establish the performance standards and then implement the requirements for these technologies to be in vehicles. And I think also to address a point that's been raised, also we're very supportive of connected vehicle technology, and we really need to have that spectrum available to be able to ensure that the vehicles and the infrastructure using those systems can operate as fully as needed to ensure that we're saving lives.
Yes, as we are suffering a little bit, as we all agreed, from the implementation of standards, I was wondering, Mandy, if the Smart Columbus initiative doesn't create the ecosystem to allow you to experiment with some things that are not necessarily enforced yet, and actually create that database that will support future legislation.
I would say to a lesser degree. I mean, we still, when we deployed our connected vehicle technology, we had to follow the national standard of what was being recommended, at least in that case. From a perspective of putting the data together, you know, our data we have a lot of it, but it was still somewhat limited due to the pandemic and people not moving. For us, what is most important is that if we're launching a technology that it's anticipated to be federally standardized, we do need to get to that standard quickly. For us as a leader in this space, we now have an appetite for technology, whereas I would say many other municipalities may not have that appetite yet. We want to be on the cutting edge, but not the bleeding edge. And we want to be collaborative. And so we work extremely well with our state DOT, with Director Jack Marchbanks and Director Lloyd McAdam. Most of my team at the city, we're all from ODOT. So we worked there and have grown up in the industry together. But, you know, again, just for us, it's extremely important for us to have those standard and guidance. We're a little bit, there are some places where there are limited standards and guidance, and we're able to iterate. And it's in one space with TSMO, Mobility on Demand and Mobility as a Service, the merger of that concept. We've been able to work with Pivot, our trip planning application, but we're integrating our traffic management center into that to bring together TSMO and MOD. We're also looking at, and that will give us a better perspective of where our higher congestion points are in more near real-time situations to understand traffic flows better, especially in the pandemic, but in this pandemic world, traffic patterns changed. So I think we as a country and we as a city are definitely going to see more nimble traffic patterns, whereas before we would look back 3 years, project for 20 and call it a day. So data has to be out there for us. Short answer, yes, we've had some opportunity to gather some data and be flexible, but we also need standards from the feds in order to efforts that we're doing and make them long-term.
Absolutely, that sounds great. So coming back to Jane, I always talk to Jane as the soundboard of everything related to the Road to Zero, given that they are the initiator of that, along with the other 3 organizations or 4. The ADAS on majority of vehicles is one of the milestones within this journey to zero deaths. And we'll be very interested in what is understood under ADAS on all vehicles, and perhaps a little bit more concrete information on how that will develop over time, and what is also the end state envisioned for that.
Well, as King alluded to in one of his previous answers, vehicle turnover, our fleet turnover, takes many, many years. And I think I saw some data recently that people hold on to their vehicles for an average of 12 years. And I actually have a vehicle in my driveway from 1983. So I'm hearing that. Yeah. So just understanding that the faster we can get some of this technology out on vehicles, the faster we can get it more fully integrated into the fleet. We know automatic emergency braking can help prevent or mitigate the effect of rear-end crashes, and hopefully save lives and prevent some of these more serious injuries that occur. There are groups, widely respected groups like the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety and Consumer Reports that have done studies on different ADAS technology to show, if fully implemented, over 10,000 lives could be saved with this technology. And some of the other ones are like lane departure warning, blind spot monitoring. Some of these crash causes that we see very frequently when you're looking at the data. Technology can really step in there and help us be better drivers behind the wheel, because sometimes we're not fully present when we're behind the wheel. But it's all about getting the technology into the vehicles as quickly as we can to get more of that fleet out there on the roads operating with the technology.
Yeah, I would like to certainly look at the data and have the chance to dissect the data along the lines of what you just described, which is perhaps the breakdown between the contribution of various ADAS technologies to reduce deaths or even accidents. The 3 or 4 that you mentioned are extremely relevant, certainly AEB and ACC and lane keep assist and blind spot detection. Those would be, that would be really interesting data guiding the industry if we could actually do the breakdown between the contribution of those specific ADAS technologies.
So as standalone technologies, those things that were mentioned are very important. And the sooner we get them more penetrating into the fleet, the better. But 2 things related to those is, one is it's important because these are building blocks to what eventually will be automated vehicles. And so it's important to not just save lives and prevent crashes now, but it's also important to improve their performance so that they can be reliable. The other thing that's important is that the sensors on vehicles themselves can only see so far. So we need that connectivity for being able to see around the curve to see if there's a queue that's stopped so that we can slow down before we get around that curve and rear end the car, or seeing around the corner, if you will. Sensors on cars cannot see around corners. So I think connectivity on top of ADAS will go further in saving lives.
Yeah, and that's a great lead in into the topic that Mandy probably is very familiar with from the practical perspective, having smart shuttles implemented within the Smart Columbus initiative. So Mandy, if you can share with us some of those, again, practical experiences, that would be great.
Sure. We had two different shuttle deployments. One was with a company called May Mobility. The other was with Easy Mile. May Mobility's vehicle was very much, it met all the federal motor carrier vehicle safety standards, so it was compliant. It averaged about 17 to 18 miles an hour. It also had a lower level of autonomy, primarily because it had that wheel. It was compliant, and a lot of the autonomy levels of autonomy were based on driver comfort with being in autonomous mode. Our Easy Mile was not compliant, and so was imported and really ran in that joystick, and it ran about 7 to 8 miles an hour. So much lower speeds, but much higher levels of autonomy when we were in passenger service. What we learned from both of those deployments is that, autonomous vehicle technology does have an opportunity to save lives and take some of the decision-making out of people's hands. It also has a ways to go. I shared in some of our earlier conversations that we did have an incident on the shuttle in February of 2020, where the shuttle's Lidar and one of its balance systems, one of the gyroscopes, were misreading the same information. And so it caused the vehicle to come to an abrupt stop. It did what it was supposed to do, but in that process, it also threw a woman into the floor, and she experienced a minor injury. We also experienced some weather challenges with the sensors, with the cameras and the LiDAR as well. So we know AV technology has a great opportunity to really start to mitigate that 94% that I think King mentioned, where humans are doing something and then an accident occurs. But we also know that AV technology has a way to go. Now, we had great experiences, particularly with Easy Mile, and we know that the companies are going to get there. But there's going to be, the one thing I do want to revisit is the infrastructure is out there, but from a city perspective, from a local government perspective, it's not super visible on how we can maybe stripe our lane lines a bit better, how it interacts with the AV technology to help provide another level of security when the vehicle is operating. I think that's something that we need to learn as cities more and ingest. I know there's been some research on it, but what types of reflectivity help drive that? And how can infrastructure play a role in certainty and increasing those speeds so that AV technology becomes a more viable option on our roadways more quickly?
Well, that would be great guidance for technology solution providers like Velodyne and many others. So we definitely would appreciate that input. So as we are approaching the end of our webinar and got to the fourth topic on our agenda today, I wanted to start because this is very dear to our hearts at Velodyne, the enhancement of the current legislation and testing validation conditions to actually capture a more realistic operating design domain for both the AVs, ADAS technologies, as well as the infrastructure. So one thing that I think has been mentioned here, but perhaps not so much emphasized, is the fact that there are certainly a very large number of VRUs dying in motor crashes, perhaps in the 60 to 100 range in 2018. There is a tremendous increase, 53% increase since 2009. So not really the trend that you would like, and 17% of all crash fatalities are pedestrians. Along those lines, what's really important, if you dissect the data further, the fact that 76% of fatal pedestrian crashes occurred in dark conditions. And if you translate it into numbers, 2,100, 2,200 almost in dark, not lighted conditions. That overlaps well with some of the findings that are mentioned also in the RAND report pertaining to the Road to Zero initiative, which highlights the fact that rural areas, for instance, are a major contributor to that in VR use. And again, we'll look at the data again, but usually in rural areas, illumination is not ideal, and that may be a contributor. So we'll see if we can also make that connection. But at Velodyne, we certainly are focused on pushing the boundaries of technology to cover these low light conditions. And one, if you want, proposal that we have and supported by data is the idea of including under 1 lux illumination conditions, so truly representative for rural areas and intersection at night, including those under 1 lux conditions in the NHTSA NCAP testing. And in order to support that, we've done also our own testing where we compared various sensing modalities, including camera and including Lidar. Lidar has a tremendous advantage just by the nature of the technology having its own source of light through the lasers that are being used in Lidar. So, and without further ado, I'd like to ask Mary to play quickly a video summarizing our findings.
Between 2009 and 2018, pedestrian fatalities increased by 53%. 90% of this increase was comprised of nighttime crashes. In 2018, 76% of pedestrian crash fatalities in the US occurred in dark conditions. Most new vehicles sold in 2018 had advanced driver assistance systems equipped with pedestrian automatic emergency braking, also known as PAEB. This enhanced automatic emergency braking feature enabled vehicles to avoid collisions with not only large objects such as vehicles, but also vulnerable road users, including pedestrians and bicyclists. Even though most pedestrian fatalities occur at nighttime and in dark conditions without streetlights, current new vehicle testing protocols largely do not evaluate the performance of PAEB in those conditions. Independent tests conducted by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA, and AAA reveal that in every scenario considered, current PAEB systems frequently fail to protect pedestrians in dark conditions. AAA found that in dark conditions, none of the 4 vehicles tested alerted the driver or slowed down for a pedestrian target crossing the road. Velodyne has been developing and testing a PAEB solution that works equally well at night and during the day. Velodyne's PAEB solution combines proprietary software called Vela with LiDAR sensors. These sensors can be easily embedded in a variety of places around the vehicle, including behind the windshield. Velodyne's Vela software interprets LiDAR data to avoid and mitigate crashes with both moving and static objects. Through predictive collision monitoring, Vela compares a vehicle's trajectory with that of other road users and objects in order to identify and avoid imminent crash scenarios. To demonstrate that improved nighttime PAB performance can be achieved by implementing readily available LiDAR technologies, Velodyne's LiDAR-based PAEB system was tested against a highly rated PAB system built around camera and radar. The tests were conducted at a driver-controlled speed targeting 30 miles per hour on a straight track, 1 hour after sunset, with less than 1 lux ambient lighting. The 2 test vehicles each had their low-beam headlights on during the trials. The scenarios in which vehicles were evaluated included crossing adult at 50% overlap at the center of the test vehicle's whip, crossing adult at 25% overlap, crossing child at 50% overlap, crossing child at 25%, adult at 75%, 10 feet behind child. Crossing adult at driver's side corner. Fallen adult at 50% overlap. The results of these nighttime tests support the findings of AAA and NHTSA that camera and radar-based PAEB systems frequently fail in dark conditions. In contrast, Velodyne's Lidar-based PAEB system, equipped with one Velodyne Lidar sensor, successfully stopped in time to avoid a crash 5 out of 5 times for every scenario tested. The availability of affordable Lidar-based PAEB solutions indicates that improved nighttime performance is a reasonable expectation for regulatory and testing agencies to implement in assessment protocols. Therefore, vehicle assessment organizations should expand PAEB testing in ambient light conditions of less than 1 lux. Velodyne's Velodyne Lidar data and Velo processing software is effective and ready for implementation, with the potential to save the lives of thousands of pedestrians annually.
Thank you, Mary. Yeah, very compelling set of test results, certainly, and supporting very well our previous discussion. We would be very happy to actually collaborate or continue to collaborate with all organizations under Road to Zero, and specifically with the panel participants in order to accelerate, which is again one of the specific items listed under or in the RAND report, accelerate the implementation of existing technologies. So looking forward to that. And with that, I would like to warmly thank you for a great input today. Great to see you again, all 3 of you, and hopefully we'll be in touch. Again, we have a very challenging mission to accomplish by 2050. Hopefully we'll be able to do a webinar in 2050 again, and hopefully with good results. And I would also like to thank the audience and encourage any questions. I haven't seen many in the chat, but you have our contact information and you can certainly access us at any time. I will let Pam comment further to that. And again, thank you very much, and we'll be back soon.
Thank you, Mircea, for joining us today. And thanks again to all of our panelists. For the audience, if we didn't get to your questions, as Mircea mentioned, that's not a problem, because you have everyone's contact information right there on your screen. So you can reach out directly with questions around LiDAR-enabled safety solutions, vulnerable road users, or infrastructure in smart cities. Again, this webinar recording will be available to view on Velodyne's YouTube channel. Thanks again to all our viewers. And if you're interested in learning more about the latest developments in the mobility industry, please be sure to join us next week when we'll be talking to Natasha Thomas, Northern California Regional Executive Director at Mothers Against Drunk Driving, also known as MAD. Natasha will be talking about the partnership between MAD and Velodyne, and why MAD believes the role of AV tech can be critical in moving towards the goal of 0 deaths caused by drunk driving. Thanks again, and we hope to see you next time.